Here is everything that you need to know about the BlackMagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. The BlackMagic Pocket 4K is a great camera at a really good price. I'm going to take some time and go over all the features and functions of the camera, and then at the end talk about some of the negative things that people have had to say about this camera and how you can fix any of those issues. Alright, let's start with the left panel. So you have some tabs here that you can pull out, and under the top one you have an input for a microphone. So if you had a small mic that's set on top of the camera with an 1/8 inch adapter, you can plug that into it. Underneath that you have your headphone jack, which is also an 1/8 inch. Then you have your HDMI port, so you can plug a monitor into it for viewing. Underneath that you have your 12-volt power supply, so you can plug some power directly into the camera. You have a USB slot, so you can record to an external SSD card for more storage. And then you also have your audio input, which is a micro XLR. So you can actually plug a professional microphone into your camera, and the camera has 48-volt phantom power. So if you have a condenser mic that requires the phantom power, it actually has that built into it. Okay, and on the right side of the camera, you have your memory slot here that you can hold a CFast card or just a regular SD card, and there are options inside the menu to decide which card you want to use. So let's kick it on and talk about some of the features of it. Now, when comparing this camera to the original BlackMagic Pocket, it's really great. It's much bigger. The screen itself is just about the size of the entire camera on the previous model, so that's really nice. And it's touchscreen, which comes in very handy when operating this camera. So first off, let's talk about the touchscreen and what we see here. So in the top left, you can see your framing guidelines, your frames per second, your shutter speed or shutter angle, your iris, or that is f-stop. It's got your time codes here, your ISO, white balance, and the battery. And then on bottom, it's got a little button there for the record, and then shows if you have a CFast or an SD card. On the bottom left corner, it has your little histogram there, and in the bottom right, it shows your audio input. If you are recording on this camera and you would like to not have all of this information on your screen, you can just pull down and that will all disappear. And when you're recording, there's still a small red button there on the bottom that lets you know that you are recording. And then you can swipe down to get all your information back. So if you swipe to the right or to the left instead of up and down, you open up some more information about your project. This is where you can type in some information about your lens or what scene or take you're on, whether you shot it inside or outside or day or night. So if you click on the lens data, this one automatically updated for me because this lens does communicate with the camera. So it tells you the f-stop that you're shooting at, the focal length, the distance from the subject, and the name of your lens. But if your lens does not communicate with the camera, you would have to update all of this manually. So if we go over to project, this is where we can name our project. We can name our director or our camera operator, or we can change the letter of the camera that we're using. I find this very useful when I'm trying to organize my clips in my SD card. The names of the files on the SD card will all begin with a letter, and that letter will correspond with whichever letter you have named your camera. So now we have 26 options of different names for our camera. So if it's a different scene or different actor or different location, we can change the name of our camera, and that will alphabetically organize our files on the SD card, and so we can change that to whatever we want, camera B. One thing to note is, at least on mine, I don't know if this is all cameras or just mine, but when I update this to say camera B, it will not update the files I record after this until I turn the camera off and back on again, and then at that point every file I record after I turn the camera back on will now be labeled with the new letter that I've named the camera. And so you can just swipe to the right or to the left again to get back to the main screen. Okay, so let's go over all the different options here on your menu. In the top left, you have quite a few options here. This is your zebras. You can turn those on and change the intensity of them down to 75%, and that's going to show if anything in your image is overexposed. You have your focus peaking, which you can turn on and off and then change the intensity of that. And that would be the little red lines that you see around whatever is in focus. That's going to help you set your focus a little easier than just going judging it by eyes. This next one is your aspect ratio, and so you can turn that on and it puts little bars on the screen to show you. You can go and set it at 16 by 9, 4.4 by 3, so you have all of those options, and that's just going to help you frame your subject a little easier based on what you might export that in, but those lines do not show up in the actual footage itself. You've got a grid that you can turn on. So you can turn on your thirds, which is good for lining up your subject in the right section of the camera. It's got the crosshair there in the middle or the center dot in the middle just to show you where the center of your image is. You have a crop that you can set, I guess, to better center your image, or if you are going to be punching in on your shots, maybe that can kind of just show you where that punching in would look like. And then the last one here is your false color, which again just kind of shows you the different lighting in the shot. Different colors represent things that are brighter or darker, and that's going to help you kind of set the lighting in your shot. So your next option here is frames per second. That starts at 23.98, which is kind of the standard for cinema. And as you drag to the right, you see you have a few options here, 30, 50, 60. So you have some set options here, and they're the more cinematic style of options. You can click the high frame rate button here on the right panel, and you can actually select any number. You're not limited to anything between 5 and 60. Now this is in the 4K mode. When you're in 1080, you can actually drag that up to 120 frames per second. But in 4K, you've got anywhere between 5 and 60. All right, next we have our shutter speed or shutter angle, and I have mine set to shutter angle, so it's at 180 degrees, and you can move that up and down with these arrows or hit the auto exposure, and it will expose it according to how much light you have in your shot. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the difference between shutter angle and shutter speed. I'm going to make another video on that because there's a lot of moving parts within those two options, but somewhere in the menu that we'll find later, you actually have the option to choose between shutter angle or shutter speed. All right, next we have our iris or our f-stop, and if you have a lens that can communicate with the camera, you can manually turn that up and down, or you can turn on auto exposure, and this is the same as the shutter angle. You can actually choose here whether or not you want to keep the shutter the same and change the iris, or if you want to keep the iris the same and change your shutter speed depending on the lighting in the shot. All right, next you have your time code, and so if you start recording, it will start a new series of time there, and then it will let you know how long the last clip was until you start recording the next time. All right, next we have our ISO, which we can change manually from 100 all the way up to 25,600. The BlackMagic Pocket 4K is a dual native ISO, so it has two native ISO options. You have 400 and 1250. So everything from 100 up to 1000 will fall under the 400 native ISO. So what that means is that the amount of light in the shot that will begin peaking as overexposed will not change whether you're at 100 or 1000. So even though you see the lighting moving up and down between these numbers here, the max lighting in your shot will not change. And so you will get ideally the same noise floor, the same amount of noise in the darks of the shot at 1250 as you would 400. So you're going to get actually more noise at 1000 than you would at 1250. And you can see here when I switch from 1000 to 1250, now we have some of our images starting to become overexposed. And as you go from 1250 all the way up to 25,600, the max exposure actually does not change. The same parts of the image are overexposed anywhere above the 1250. All right, next is the white balance option, which we can change manually from 2500 all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin, which puts us inside the custom white balance option. Or we can select daylight, which is 5600 Kelvin. There's tungsten. We have a few other options, cloudy. Or we can hit auto white balance. And if you have a white balance card or just a piece of paper or something white that you can put in front of the camera, make sure that it is inside of this small square here. Hit update white balance, and it will automatically set your white balance according to the lighting in your shot. Now we have the buttons on the right side of the camera. The first one is to auto adjust your aperture or your iris or f-stop. So if you do have a lens that can communicate with the camera, you can press that button and it will automatically expose your shot by adjusting the aperture of your lens. The next button is your autofocus button, and if you press that, it will autofocus to wherever your focus point is set on the screen. You can change that by pressing and holding on the camera, and that will also autofocus to wherever you pressed. So one thing to note about the autofocus is it is not continuous, and it does take a little bit of time. It has to do some searching to find the subject. It does a pretty accurate job, but because it bounces back and forth and it's not very smooth and it's not continuous, I would not recommend using this for autofocusing during the shot. Maybe if you're doing like an interview and you get the autofocus set and hold it there, it's great for that. But if not, I would just do manual focusing for most of your video shooting. Next, we have our high frame rate option, which just bounces you back and forth between your normal frame rate and whatever you have set for your high frame rate, which is nice if you want to quickly go back and forth between 24 frames a second and 60 frames a second. You have that option there. It will bounce you back and forth. Next, we have the zoom function. And if you press that, it takes you in twice as close to your image, which is really nice for setting your focus, especially if you have a lens that doesn't communicate with the camera. And then if you click and drag, you can move around your image and look at different parts of it. And then if you double tap on the screen, it will actually activate that zoom function also. Next, we have our menu button and then our playback button. So with the arrows, you can navigate through some of the different shots you've done. You can play it, or you can drag your playhead through the footage. So let's look at our menu, and the first tab is our record tab. This is where we'll choose whether we want to shoot in BlackMagic RAW or in ProRes. If we choose BlackMagic RAW, we have constant bitrate or constant quality. The bit rates are a compression of 3:1 all the way up to 12:1, so just a slight difference there in quality. Or we can choose constant quality and we can choose a lower or a higher quality. And then in each of those, we can choose the size of our shot, anywhere from full 4K to Ultra HD 4K or just regular 1080 HD. One thing to note is that if you do shoot in 1080, it's a censored window, so you're essentially cropped in 2 times the amount. So if you're shooting on a 35mm lens, it will actually come across as a 70mm lens in the 1080. That is not the case in the full 4K. In your ProRes options here, you have the same size options, but you have slightly different options here in the quality. So you can choose high quality, 422, light, or proxy, and they all range in different qualities and how much space it's taking up on your card. And then if we click over, we have a few options here. We can choose between the video, extended video, or film dynamic range. I would suggest using film most of the time. Maybe if you want to very quickly edit something, you can choose the video dynamic range, but the video dynamic range is smaller and you won't get the full 13 stops that you will from the film. Then you have the option to change your project frame rate, which you can change on the front screen as well. And then you have your preferred card. So if you have a CFast or an SD, or you can just choose to record to whichever card is fullest at that time. All right, next we have a time-lapse option. And so you can scroll here and choose anywhere between capturing 1 frame every 2 frames, all the way up to 1 frame every 10 minutes. So if you want a nice time-lapse of a sunset or something like that, you can choose that option here. If not, you're gonna wanna turn that back off before you go to your front screen so that you're not filming in time-lapse. The next tab is the monitor tab, and you have the option here between LCD or HDMI. So your LCD is what you see here, and you can adjust settings separately from your HDMI, which would be your external monitor, and then you have settings that you can do to both of them. So you have the option to turn on and off your LUT, your zebras, focus assist, frame guides, grids, safe areas, and your false color. but those are controlled separately from your monitor and your LCD screen. So let's say that on the LCD you wanted to show the zebras, the focus assist, but not the LUT. And on your HDMI, you wanted the LUT, but you don't want the zebras or the focus assist. You can control those separately so that you don't have to see necessarily the same exact information on both the LCD and the external monitor. So some of the settings that you can change for both of them would be your aspect ratio of the frame guides. On the focus assist, you can choose between peak, which just kind of adds extra detail to whatever's in focus, or the colored lines. And then you can choose your low, medium, high, and you can change the color of the line. So right now I've got it set on red, but we can change that to green, blue, there's white, and black. I typically keep it on red. I seem to be able to see that the easiest when your focus is changing. And then you can change the zebra levels again down to 75, which all that can also be controlled from your front screen. And then you have a few more options on this other tab, whether or not you want to do thirds, crosshair, or the dot, and then the opacity of the safe area guide. The next tab is our audio tab, and from here you can change your input option. So right now we're just set to camera mono, so it's just the internal microphone from the camera, but we can change that. We have some options here. We have the XLR line, the XLR mic, the 3.5 millimeter line, and then some other options here. So let's say that we have the XLR mic input going to our channel 1. We can change the gain up and down, and then if you tab over, you have your headphone volume and your speaker volume, but then since we are on XLR mic, we have the phantom power option, and it's a 48 volt phantom power, which is really nice for an external condenser mic. You can plug that straight into the camera and not have to use another source like a zoom. It's not the best quality. The sound floor is a little bit higher than what you would probably get out of a zoom or an external recorder, but it is really nice to not have to sync up audio in post. All right, next we have our setup tab, which you can set the date and time, the language. You can choose between shutter angle or shutter speed. We talked a little bit about that before, but I'm not going to get much into those. I will in a later video. Next we have our function option. So we have function 1, 2, and 3. Those are buttons on top of the camera, and you can choose what those do. So right now function 1 does false color, function 2 turns on your LUT, and function 3 turns on your frame guides. And so you can choose whether or not you want that on LCD or HDMI, and then that is your toggle option, or you can set them to a preset, and that can change your frames per second, your f-stop, your white balance, anything that you want to here. There's a lot of options for those function buttons on top of the camera. Next we have our tally light, which is this red light that shows you when you are recording. You can turn that on and off, and then change the intensity of how bright that light is. And then here are some factory resets and your hardware ID and just some of the other information about the camera. All right, next we have our Bluetooth option, which we can turn on and off to sync up to our phone or iPad. There's an app where you can actually control quite a few functions of the camera from your phone, which is a pretty cool feature to have on this camera, especially when you are operating this camera by yourself. You can record or change the focus or the aperture or things like that from the phone. All right, next is the presets tab, and this is where you can save settings from your camera. So if there's one location that you do a lot of filming at, you can save your white balance and your ISO and your aperture, keep it all saved in a preset, and then with one click you can adjust all your settings back to where you want them. Next we have our LUTs tab, and so this is where you can upload your own LUTs, or you can choose from some of the LUTs that BlackMagic has provided with the camera. These are really nice to have when you're shooting. It kind of gives you an idea of what your shot will look like once you've done some color correction and maybe even color grading, depending on what kind of LUT you have on there. But it's good to know that the LUT is not baked into the image, so when you pull the footage off the card onto your camera, you still get the raw footage. There's no LUT baked into it, but you can view those LUTs on the camera itself or on your monitor. All right, we have a few buttons here on top of the camera. We have function 1, 2, and 3. Those toggle settings on and off, and we talked about inside the menu where you can change what each of those functions do. And then we have our quick select buttons here. We have ISO, shutter speed, and white balance. If you want to quickly pull those up on the screen where you can make adjustments there, they're the same adjustments that you can make if you select the same options on the screen itself. Then we have our record buttons, which are here on top of the camera, and then there's a small one on the front of the camera. They've given a couple options for just whichever one is easier to click at the time. And then this button with the camera on it is the photo capture button. And so you can actually take photos with this camera. They're not the best photos, but it is nice to have that function sometimes. One thing to note is while you're recording, the photo capture will not work. You have to be not recording to be able to take a photo. As you can see, this camera has a ton of features and functions to it. I think I covered everything, but if I missed something, just let me know. It's pretty easy to overlook something when you're talking about a menu as intensive as the BlackMagic Pocket 4K, but this really is an amazing camera. The fact that it shoots raw footage at 4K at 24 or 60 frames per second really makes this a powerhouse camera for cinematography, for B-roll. It's great for weddings. It can be used for some lower end commercials. The image quality on it is really, really good, especially for the price. This camera rivals cameras that cost even 10 times as much as what you can get the BlackMagic for. One of the negative things that people have said about this camera is the weight of it. It's made out of plastic, so it doesn't weigh very much. Which could be a pro or a con. If you've got this camera in your hand all day, you might like the fact that it's not heavy, but because it's so light, it's pretty easy to get shaky footage just because there's not much weight to it. So one way to combat that would be to get a shoulder rig or just some other device that helps hold this camera wider, or to add some weight to it, and that will help you get a little bit more stable of a shot. Another negative thing people have said about this camera is its low battery life. I have several batteries for the camera. They all last about 20 or 30 minutes, so I'm constantly charging and changing out batteries, which is kind of annoying. So I got this external battery. This is a juice box, and it gives me about 2 hours of film time, which is not bad. So if you're not at a place where you can plug the camera directly into an outlet, then I would suggest either getting several batteries for it or an external battery to put on your rig. I think that wraps up everything that you need to know about the BlackMagic Pocket 4K. My suggestion is to buy one. There's not a better camera out there at this price range. I really don't think you'll regret it. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be putting out more videos diving deeper into different aspects of this camera, so be looking out for those. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.